Hi. I like the idea of TEDx talks. They're the closest thing we have, I think, to the old ancient Greek idea of a symposium. Although there is one critical difference for those of you who know a bit about ancient Greek culture. You guys should all be drunk right now, and all the speakers would be drunk too. But I actually just have a cold, and that's tea for me. So I'm going to be talking today about diversity in a different sense than many people are used to hearing about it. And this is because talking about the ancient Greeks, they had a very interesting and powerful notion about the world. They believed in a world of types. The most famous form of this is the Platonic ideals or Platonic forms. They thought there was an essential type that things were, and the variation from that was essentially kind of meaningless or not important. Now that's been a very powerful idea intellectually, and in many areas of the natural sciences, it's been a great idea. Within physics, the idea that there were certain particles that all shared the same behavior was incredibly powerful. Within chemistry, the idea of the periodic table, that there were elements that were almost identical in their behavior, but totally different between elements, was also a really, really powerful idea. But in biology, it's fundamentally false in a very deep sense. And biology is the natural science that's done away in many senses with typological thinking. But in popular culture, we still tend to think in very typological or essentialistic terms. And what I want to tell you today is some principles that come out of biology, the natural science that has been studying natural systems that show important variation and where typology fails, and how that applies in many areas of human endeavor as well. Okay, so it's basically biological organization gives you principles to deal with truly diverse systems, where diversity is not just measurement error, it's not just some little frill around the outside, but is essential to the system. And the principle one I want to give you is that for these kinds of systems, these complex systems, typological thinking is really a logical error. And I'm really surprised at how often people still do this, still make this error. And I'm going to show you a simple example. It's close to what we mean by stereotypical thinking, by the way, although we tend to only get upset about stereotypes when they're negative, and positive stereotypes are every bit as typological and have the same problems. This is a typological error in practice. Men are faster than women. Is this true? First of all, in a certain sense, it is. This is the recent results of last year's New York City Marathon. And the men are in red, and the fastest pace are to the left, the slowest pace is to the right. And what you see is the red curve is basically shifted towards faster paces. The green curve, which are the women, are slower. On average, men are about 10% faster than women at almost every speed, every distance that you calculate. This is a robust result found in thousands and thousands of different races. So in a certain sense, it's true. Men, on average, are faster than women. We get very afraid of looking at a group distance like this because we think typologically. And we think it leads to a logical syllogism. Men are faster than women, therefore women shouldn't be hired for a job if it requires physical speed. And what I'm saying is that this is just an error. Actually, group differences are widely found on almost any kind of group that you have, but the variation within the group is often much larger and more important than those small group means. And we don't need to be threatened by a small difference in group. Many people think to admit even a small thing, something as simple that men may be on average faster than women, admits a whole level of discrimination, and it shouldn't. It's actually just a logical error. And in biology, we've been dealing with that. A simple example of this is me. I'm actually off the chart because they've rescaled this. But that would be me if I ever run a marathon. I'm the world's slowest runner. And if you hired me over the woman who won the race in an under 7-minute mile, 26 miles in a row, I can't do that for 1 mile, you would be making a horrible error. The variation between genders in this case vastly swamps. The variation of individuals within each gender vastly swamps the small mean difference. And that's the important essential point. And biologists have finally, literally from Aristotle until Darwin and Wallace, biologists were caught in typology as well. But Darwin and Wallace actually got us out of that way of thinking. Why should any variable individual be treated as if they reflected their group mean? There's no reason for that. There's no reason, I think, culturally, and there's certainly no reason within biology. It's just a mistake, and you will fundamentally misunderstand what goes on in biological systems. That means that whenever we make statements about groups, we have to remember they're not about essential types. They're probabilistic statements. On average, men are faster than women, but many, many women, about 40%, are faster than the average male. And that's an important distinction, and we forget that all the time. And if we don't, it literally blinds us to the incredibly important role that variation plays. It's actually important to recognize it because it's actually really useful in biological systems, it's essential to them, and it's useful in society, and that's what I'm going to talk about a bit as well. The simple reason is variation is the key to adaptation. This is the principle that Darwin and Wallace discovered coincidentally at the same time. I actually think Wallace's paper, who's less well known, his original one was better than Darwin's. Variation is the source of adaptation. We don't really care about the mean values, the average values. The critical thing is the innovation, the adaptation, the rare individual within a biological species that does something different. That actually determines the future evolution of the system, literally and figuratively in many other systems. The generation of diversity is also critical to us. Our immune systems evolve every day of your life, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Evolution is not just something that happened millions of years ago when dinosaurs were around. It's not just something that happens on the Galapagos Islands to a couple of finches. It happens every day in every body all the time. Principle 3, diversity can be precisely measured. And here I may lose a few of you, and that's fine. I'm going to show you a couple of math equations. They're very simple. You don't have to understand them, but I actually do think it's important. Knowing how to measure something is actually very important to scientific inquiry. And we know how to measure diversity in a very precise way. We often, even as biologists, use proxies for diversity. Species richness, for example, is a common one, just the number of species in a community. But that fundamentally misses something. And what it misses is the fact that we don't just need a number of different species, we need a lot of individuals of those different species. It addresses the problem of tokenism in a cultural sense, that if you have one individual of every group, but only one, and it's dominated by another kind of individual, whatever that kind is, it's a less diverse system. And it has a precise mathematical form. We can actually measure diversity as if it were a force or a temperature, which makes it really useful and open to scientific inquiry. The form is the exponentiation of h, where h is Shannon's entropy. And not many people will know this, but Shannon's entropy is a very fundamental equation in information theory that basically tells you the amount of surprise in the system. How likely, when you move through a system, are you likely to be surprised by the next person you meet? Are they likely to have a different background, a different language, a different culture than you? And this measures this quite precisely. This was actually recently clarified by a biologist named Lou Jost, who I just have to kind of give a shout out to because he's one of my current scientific heroes. He spends most of his time finding new orchid species in the Ecuadorian cloud forest and the rest of his time doing basic mathematical biology kind of as a side project. This shows the basic form of that equation, which is all you really need to know. And this shows the two-species case, just species A and species B. And what you find on the left-hand side, you have all species A. And on the right-hand side, you have all species B. And the diversity measure, Jost's D, actually shows that the mix of types, when you're in the center, is where you have the most diversity, the most surprise, the most different kinds of groups of individuals. This captures a lot of what we care about with human diversity as well. And imagine you're in an undiverse situation. And here's a guy and his 2005 era flip phone. Let's say he's an investment banker. He kind of looks like an investment banker to me. And he's making a new investment. But this time it's an agricultural company. This is outside of his area of expertise. So he looks for someone else in his company to get their opinion. Unfortunately, it's someone very much like him. And so he asks the next guy, who also has the exact same skill set. They may all be individually very bright, but if they are missing this piece of information, no matter how many people he asks in his undiverse corporation, the group is no smarter than the individual. And this is an important consequence of low diversity. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. But let's show the counterexample. Let's say you have the same guy, but he's at a different company that actually cares about getting people from different backgrounds. He's still interested in making an acquisition of an agricultural company. Fortunately, somebody there knows something about agriculture. Maybe it's a farmer who works part-time as a consultant. Maybe it's just the gardener, but he takes him seriously and asks his opinion because he knows things that the investment banker does not. Now, there are costs to diversity. There could be a pitchfork accident. Fortunately, somebody else knows about medicine, can maybe stanch the wound. If you're giving a TED talk, you need to know how to smile and gesticulate properly. So the point is when you're in a diverse community, the community itself becomes intelligent in a very real way, smarter than any of the individuals in it. This is how biology works. This is how evolution works. Diversity is critical to understanding whether it will actually meet a challenge, whether it'll adapt to a new situation. In this case, it may save your company. Principle 4. A more diverse system often leads to more robust system function. And there's a classic example And robustness, sorry, that went by again, is about the same as resilience, close to what you mean. When you're challenged, you're able to meet that challenge successfully. The example we just talked about is a version of that. You're able to make the right decision when challenged by a new challenge that you've never had before and is outside of your individual skill set. This has been found in many ecological systems, and there's a classic example by Dave Tillman and John Downing. They actually set up experimental grassland plots of varying diversity, number of species within each plot. They actually set this up for another reason. Then a horrible drought happened. They thought their entire experiment was going to be a failure, but they actually found something very, very interesting. And what they found is in the high diverse grasslands, 25 species, they only lost 40% of the biomass. You had 60% of the grassland still there. But in the low diversity plots, on average, you lost 90%. Now, this is really interesting to an ecologist, but if you're a farmer who maybe has pasture-raised cows, if you have a low diversity monocrop and 10% of your original amount of grass, your cows are all dead. If you have a high diverse system, 40% loss is not great, but there's a good chance your cows have survived and you've survived as a farmer. So diversity really matters for this system as well. Principle 5 is one of my favorites. When the problem is really hard, the best solution is often to make many, many solutions and then select the best one. It's a very, very different way of doing things. A lot of computer programs do this now using what are called Darwinian algorithms. And there are many examples of this. There's a good story, I think it's a great story. Linus Pauling, one of my favorite scientists, a very famous chemist, one of the very few people to win 2 Nobel Prizes. He was asked by his graduate student, Dr. Pauling, how do you manage to have so many great ideas? Pauling's reply, oh, I just have lots of ideas and throw away the bad ones. This is exactly how your immune system works, and this is what I alluded to earlier. Your immune system actually intentionally recombines and mutates your own DNA within your immune system, generating billions of different antibody variants, and then every time you're sick, it selects out the very best one and uses that as a molecular medicine out of billions that is uniquely designed for the virus you've been challenged with, for example. It almost always wins. It's such a powerful mechanism, generating this diversity and then finding the right answer within that. It doesn't know the right answer at the outset, but it's able to recognize it because it's effectively working. This is why 99.9% of the viruses you're challenged with, many of which would kill you, including the one I have right now, are usually completely self-limited by your immune system. It's an extraordinary pharmacological machine. Principle 6, maximizing the benefits of diversity means giving up central control. This is an interesting one, and it has a lot of implications for human society and how we organize things. Much of biological control is bottom-up rather than top-down. It's much more like Wikipedia than it is like Encyclopedia Britannica. And that makes a lot of people worried, but like Wikipedia, it actually works quite well and more robustly than you might think. And it makes sense because if you have all these diverse information sources, what's the point if all the decisions are made by a central command that doesn't have all that information or only gets it after a delay? I think arguably this is one of the fundamental flaws in Marxism. Marx was so interested in central control and central planning, and it's been pretty disastrous in many places where it's been implemented. Now, a lot of people think there are parts of biology that work like central command, and the brain is the most common example people come up with. And many people think your brain runs everything. I teach anatomy, and I often get this definition of the brain in early labs. Central nervous system command center, controls all body functions. It's fundamentally false in a number of ways. Part of it is because your body is much more modular. Your heart can be completely disconnected from your brain, all neural connections severed, and your heart works just fine. It starts beating faster when you exercise, it beats slower when you don't. The only difference is when you go to a scary movie, it doesn't start beating quite so quickly when you start anticipating at a high level. But other than that, it works just fine. Your kidneys as well are quite independent in their function. A lot of biology is modular and independent, and the control is largely local. It's also wrong in a much more fundamental sense. If you take the brain and you sever the connection to the body, after death at this point, but in the interest of science, and you look at this main conduit between the brain and your body, you find something quite beautiful. I do find anatomy quite beautiful. This is a cross-section of a human spinal cord, and what you find is first this beautiful kind of butterfly pattern of cell bodies. Those are the gray areas in the center. But all of the lighter colored areas, the so-called white matter. This is axons bundled together in nerves, and it's the information passing to and from your body and brain. Now, what's interesting, and this next graph is a little complex, but all you need to look at is the colors, are all these different tracks have been mapped out, and we know what goes on in each of them. And when you look at the red regions, those are the motor regions. Those are the areas where your brain is actually telling your body what to do. This is the command and control. And if you look at the blue regions, this is the sensory regions. These are the tracts where you're getting information from your body. And just note which area is larger. The sensory regions, where your brain is listening to your body, not commanding it, are about twice as big as the areas in which commands are going out. This means if you're the brains of an operation, you should be a very good listener. You should be spending most of your time listening to your diverse information sources and integrating that, and only much more rarely taking a command position. And this is found in much of biology. The brain is one of the more centralized systems, and still, in many ways, it's the opposite of what most people think of when they first think of leadership. Principle 7, diversity has different components, and this has a particular application today, and there's a little bit of jargon here. Ecologists divide diversity into alpha diversity and beta diversity. Alpha diversity is the diversity in one place, like if we measured in this one room. The beta diversity is the difference from place to place, how different localities are. This is important today because the world is changing in a very fundamental way, and these two pieces of information, these two categories are really useful because we mix up the world much more than it's ever been mixed up before. The process of globalization, of transfer of humans, of organisms, of languages, and of information is changing fundamentally the isolation that led to enormous beta diversity. What this means is that, there was a recent study of Hawaii that showed the rate of invasions in Hawaii has actually gone up 100,000 times, 5 orders of magnitude since humans made it to Hawaii. Before that, only very rare species made it there. So invasive species are one of the biggest things for the ecology of Hawaii. But this is also true in human society. In general, the alpha diversity is going up. If you go from city to city, you can find many more different ethnic restaurants than you could 50 years ago. But if you go to the next city, you'll find often the very same set of ethnic restaurants, sometimes with almost identical menus. This is happening biologically as well. When you go from one community to the other, you find sometimes more species in one spot, but it's the same species time after time. You find grackles everywhere, and crows everywhere, and rats everywhere. So this is one of the biggest changes. This often leads to local extinctions of endemic species found only in one spot. And culturally, one of the biggest changes is we're losing 80% of the languages on the planet because the isolation, the beta diversity of human cultures is being degraded faster than it's ever been degraded before. Okay, now there's two things where I want to apply what I've talked about a little bit. And the first is because this is TEDxKalamazooCollege, Kalamazoo College, I want to apply it to one case of educational policy. It's one I agree with in some ways, but not completely. There's kind of a current fad. Like all fads, it has some truth to it. Lecture is ineffective and that we need to flip all classrooms. In fact, I saw a recent review that showed that they actually posited that it's unethical to teach by lecture anymore. Because it's just less effective. But when you actually looked at the review, it was quite interesting. What you often found was very modest gains, and you found huge heterogeneity of results. You found some cases where you had negative gains from flipping classrooms. This is basically getting rid of lecture, doing a more bottom-up type of learning, which I have a lot of sympathy with. But in some cases, it doesn't work at all. Now, this is the men are faster than women problem. Just because even if it works a little better on average does not mean it's always good to just completely flip every classroom. Why? Because lecturers vary in their ability to engage students, and students vary in their ability to engage with lecture. And it's incredibly important. I also think there's a more personal side to this, too. I'd have to say that in my own college experience, I think there were maybe 4 or 5 professors that I learned 90% of everything I learned from, and they all lectured. Even if the average class got a little better, if I had missed out on that, my own educational benefit would have been a fraction of what it actually was. So anyway, the key is to identify when lecture works and when it doesn't. When it doesn't work, absolutely, you should change. But you shouldn't pretend it's a magic bullet that applies in every situation when you have variable institutions, variable lecturers, and variable students. Okay, now the last one is hopefully after doing this, you're going to use diversity and your understanding of the importance of diversity, that the average is not always what you care about, to save your life. And here's the scenario I want you to imagine. Not a pleasant one. Imagine you've been diagnosed with aggressive metastatic cancer. That means it's spreading everywhere through your body. You have only weeks to live. There are, however, 2 promising drugs. They're both in experimental trials, but you can only choose one. And the question is, which one do you choose? And here's the data, and this is very much how the data is usually presented in the literature. What you find is drug A and drug B. This is, on the bottom, the concentration of the drug required to kill 50% of the cells. It's a standard measure, very sciencey kind of measure. On the y-axis is the probability. This is how often it happens when you test it in the lab. What you find is the blue pill takes twice as long, a concentration of 20, before it starts killing the cancer cells, kills half of them. The red pill kills them after only 10 days. Now the question is, which one do you take? the red pill or the blue pill? Almost all current oncological practice would say, take the red pill, but I would take the blue pill. And does anybody know why? Because of the variation. I don't care about the average. If I have aggressive metastatic cancer going through my body, I don't care about the first cancer cells killed. I care about the last ones. And when you zoom on this graph, what you see is as you increase the concentration, the red pill, while it works better at the beginning and you initially think it's great, actually kills the cancer more slowly by the end. And the problem with aggressive metastatic cancer is it's reproducing. These daughter cells of these resistant cells will create more daughter cells that are also resistant to the cancer. And you will end up with drug-resistant cancer much more likely with the red pill than with the blue pill. The blue pill is much more deterministic. I've flipped the problem here. Here, the cancer is solving the problem of how to survive under your chemotherapeutic regime. And its variation allows it to solve that problem successfully. It's a little weird thinking from the cancer's point of view, but it's a really useful way. And current oncology is starting to recognize the importance of this. So hopefully, after this, I've convinced you a little bit that diversity matters. It can save your company, it can save your cows, and it can even save your life. Thank you.